To Google Community Hangout today for the OpenShift Origin community here at Red Hat. I'm really pleased today to have Vlad Yavanov from the Uhuru software team to come about a major announcement that was made a couple weeks back about bringing .NET functionality and SQL Server functionality to OpenShift and to the OpenShift Origin code base as well. That a couple of other team members joining us today who've worked on it. Danielle from Uhurusoft, Michael from Uhurusoft, Munral from Red Hat is with us, and Krishna Raman, who both of whom have done some of the work on it, and I think we have a couple others who will be joining us in a little bit. But it was a wonderful team effort, and we are really happy to have that code base now merged into project, and I'm going to let, without too much further ado, Vlad take it over and give us a little background into what this all means and how you can start some .NET onto your OpenShift as well. And thank you, Vlad, for agreeing to do this morning.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for joining, and I'm going to give you all an introduction to the work that we've been doing to extend OpenShift to Windows. And I'll start by describing the changes that we had to make to Origin in order to support multiple platforms other than Linux. So we modified the broker so that it can gather cartridges, gather a list of cartridges from nodes that live on different platforms, such as Linux and Windows. And this is done by filtering the nodes based on mcollected facts. And now the cartridges themselves will be able to specify on which platform they want to live. There will be a new attribute called platform, and this will default to Linux, so it doesn't break anything. But for Windows cartridges, you'll see in their manifest YAML, you'll see a platform called Windows. We also changed how the Linux node handles the HA proxy card, and this handling of the HA proxy card can now be different for each platform. So these are, in a nutshell, the changes that we made to Origin, and I'm going to talk a bit about what we implemented on the Windows node now. We use mcollective just like the Linux node does to talk to the broker, and we actually use the same agent DDL. The agent is Ruby, but every call that is made through the agent actually gets translated into a .NET code, and by translate I mean .NET executables get called from the agent. We also built the Windows installation library for sandboxing, and one of our colleagues, Steffi Schneider, published a blog today describing this in much more detail. So now we have the Windows node, and it can talk to the Linux broker. We need cartridges. So we created a few cartridges so far. We have a .NET cart that supports .NET versions 2.0 to 4.5. It uses an IS hostable web core to host your applications. And then for databases, we added two Microsoft SQL cartridges for both SQL Server 2008 and 2012. And we started off by using PowerShell to create these cartridges. So the control scripts and everything that you're used to writing in Bash on Linux, we wrote in PowerShell on Windows. But to improve performance, we added a mechanism that allows you to write your cartridges control script in C# and have it be compiled by the node so that you improve performance. Um, I'm going to move on to this visual representation of what we built. I wanted to show that both these nodes, both the Windows node and Linux node, use the same communication mechanisms, both to talking to the Linux broker. Like I said, we use mcollective for that, but also the same communication mechanisms exist for talking to the dev or the admin. So that happens via SSH, and either the dev or the admin can log into Windows machines using SSHD, the SSHD service that's available in Cygwin, and run commands, look at their files, etc. For browsing the application, again, we try to use as much of the Linux world as possible to add to the Windows world. So we use the same load balancing mechanism for the Windows applications as we do for Linux. So when you create a Windows app, what happens is an HA proxy cart gets created, and your requests will pass through that HA proxy that sits on Linux, and then they get forwarded to the Windows application. Okay, so now we have like an overview of what we've built. I would now like to give you the actual demo, which involves creating an application on my dev environment here. I'm going to be using the entire palette of tools that you have for working with OpenShift on Windows. So normally someone might not do this this way. They wouldn't use so many tools for one applications, but I'm just doing this to show everything to you. So I'm gonna create an app called MS SQL Demo. Use the .NET cartridge. Oh, first, sorry. Let me actually show you the cartridges. So you'll see in the list, we'll have the .NET cartridge, .NET 4.5, and we'll have two Microsoft SQL cartridges, Microsoft SQL 2008 and 2012. So now I'm going to create my app, MS SQL Demo, cartridge.net, and make it scalable. All applications that that are Windows-based have to be scalable, because we want that HA proxy to sit in front of our application. So right now the broker is looking up a Windows node using mcollective facts to filter the list of all available nodes. And it's telling it to create a gear, configure it, but at the same time it's also looking for a Linux node and setting up that HA proxy I was talking about. So after this this application is created, we'll be able to browse it. We'll see that it has an interface similar to other templates that are available on OpenShift. Okay, let's just browse this. Okay, so welcome to your .NET application on OpenShift. This is deployed on a Windows server. We have a couple of options here to display environment variables. You can see that these are Windows specific. You have your program files directory there. And just to show you a familiar screen, this is the usual error page that you get when you don't treat exceptions in ASP.NET. So now we have an application, but it doesn't have a database connected to it, associated with it. So we should add a cartridge to it, a Microsoft SQL cartridge. So now I'm using the web console of OpenShift, and we see that the application is available here. We have 2 gears on it. We have the .NET 4.5 cartridge deployed on a Windows gear, and we have the web load balancer that sits on Linux. So we now want to add a card. Let's add the Microsoft SQL Server 2012 card. So as you can see, the developer doesn't see any difference. Whether he uses the command line or he uses the web interface, Windows and Linux applications are treated the same. Same tools are available to him. And speaking of that, while this is happening, I can show you the administration console. And again, Windows is treated the same as Linux. We're going to refresh this. We see that we have 2 nodes available. One of them is the broker. It also has a node role. And we have the Windows node. And again, we can drill down here and see that we have gears on it. So whether it's a Windows node or a Linux node, all of the tools are available in the same way that you're familiar with. Okay. So our SQL Server database was added. We have our credentials here. We have the connection URL. Now we can actually deploy the application, deploy our code. Before we do that, I would like to show you one more thing about the tools that developers can use to work with their applications. So we're going to connect using SSH to our Windows gear. So let's show app or MS SQL demo and look at the gears. We'll have 3 gears here, and one of them is our .NET gear. Just going to grab the SSH URL and SSH to it. So we have here the a Cygwin prompt, and I can start the Windows command prompt here and do dir.
Well, that's so scary. That's hilarious.
Yeah, a lot of fun. So we'll just exit this right now, and you can imagine that since this is a Cygwin environment, you can use tail, and mostly everything that is available to you on Linux will be available for your Windows applications as well. Okay, so I'm now going to continue with our application, and I'm going to move to Visual Studio, and I'm actually going to show you a Visual Studio extension that we've been working on that allows you to deploy applications directly from Visual Studio using binary deployments. So I have here a small demo app that does some database work. What you have to do with this extension is you start by configuring your application for deployment to OpenShift. You get the screen here, and I've already configured it in the interest of time, saving time. You connect to an OpenShift server. You're asked for credentials. We handle tokens for you. Then you select the domain you want to deploy on, gear size, pick an application name, select the cartridges that you want to be available in your application, and then save. When you save, an OpenShift configuration file gets created next to your application, so that every time you deploy, all the information can be gathered from there. So now I can simply deploy to OpenShift, and we'll see here a log about what is happening. Now, this extension is built entirely in C#. Like I mentioned, we handle tokens, we handle SSH keys, we create SSH keys and save them in the registry if you don't have any. we upload them to OpenShift so that after your application is created, we can deploy, we can upload a tarball of your application and have a binary deployment done on the server side. Now, this ran quite quickly because the application is already created. If the application hadn't been created, Visual Studio would have created it for us, again, with all of the cartridges necessary. So, here's what I'm trying to say is that you can use whatever mechanism you'd like, either the command line, Visual Studio, or the web interface, and do all of these steps using just that particular tool. Okay, so now we have the application available. We'll just browse it again, and this is our application. Okay, so this is a very simple ASP.NET app. We will go to the demo page, and we see here that we have information from our environment variables. We have a host name that we can use to connect to the database. We have a port, username, and password. And right now what I'm going to do is try to display visitors. So we have very basic functionality here. We can create the metadata in the database, like just a simple table. We can record a visitor, so the source IP of the person who's clicking the button, and then display the records in the database. Of course, at this point in time, there's nothing in the database. So when I click Display Visitors, we expect an error. And I can actually use Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio to connect to this SQL Server instance. I'm just going to copy this host name and use the port specified there, just 10,013. And I'm going to grab this password. So we see our database instance here, and we'll see that it's completely empty. And now we're just going to create metadata. We refresh Management Studio. We see that we have a table here with columns and everything. Then we can start putting some data in it. Then we display visitors, and voila, we have data in the database. So I hope this shows how easy it is to work with OpenShift and how easy it is to connect your application to a database. But I want to explain a bit further on how it works to get a bit deeper. So when a request comes in to your application, when an application is browsed from the outside, a request comes into the HA proxy, and then in turn will forward it to your Windows application that lives in a Windows gear. That in turn has environment variables configured for it that tell it how to connect to your database gears. That in this particular setting, they live on the same machine, on the same virtual machine, but in a larger cloud, they could be on a different Windows node. So my current deployment, my dev environment here is formed of two nodes, a rel VM that has a broker and a node installed on it, and a Windows node that has all of the prerequisites, Microsoft SQL, both version 2008 and 2012 installed on it. So the developer who uses RHC or Visual Studio 2013 will first hit the broker, and then or the HA proxy, and then the Windows VM. Of course, if you SSH into the Windows gear directly, you'll hit the Windows VM directly. Okay, so I believe that this is it.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Can I ask a quick question? So back on the last screen, perhaps if you could explain, for my purpose, because I haven't been playing in the Microsoft world for a while, and I know there's some license management stuff that has to go on. So if I'm using SQL Server, I need to have a license for it. How does this manage the licensing?
So the person that installs SQL Server will have to provide the license key. So licensing is handled at installation time, and users are not bothered by that, I would say. So Microsoft SQL Server instance gets created on the fly for them, and that SQL Server instance gets sandboxed the same way as applications do. Um, those SQL Server instances are not Windows services; they're actually run as each as an individual process. But as far as I know, they share the same license that was provided during installation time.
Okay, that's good to know. And I know because we're so open source centric that we don't really pay attention to that, but I think in the Microsoft world that becomes important again. So
Right.
Thank you very much.
Sure. So I had my last slide here for questions, and of course to invite everyone to look at our GitHub repository and fork it and help us make it better.
That's perfect. So one of the other questions, because I love that you did the demo using your own installation of OpenShift Enterprise, but I'm curious about the process for installing using Origin, since this is the community hangout. What's the roadmap for getting the documentation and gear for that, and how would you suggest if somebody wanted to use this new functionality with Origin today, what should they try and do?
Okay, so I want to start by saying that we're working on documentation for a start-to-finish deployment of Origin with .NET support. It's not quite ready yet, but if you want to get started before we publish that, you of course have to have an Origin installation that contains the pull request that we did a couple of weeks ago that has all of these multi-platform changes. And then you can use the documentation available in our GitHub repo to try and add a Windows node, configure it, actually build the Windows installer, and then connect this new Windows node to your Origin installation. So the roadmap is that in 1 to 2 weeks we'll have this documentation available, and more than likely a pre-built Windows installer. So that makes it easy
Perfect.
for everyone.
Awesome. Then we can make sure that we bring you back and we can walk through doing all that as well as another hangout. I'd love to have you back to do that.
Cool.
So it's so the other thing that sometimes people ask me is the difference between the isolation, and you mentioned that there was a blog post that just went up today, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference between the isolation that we use for Linux and the isolation that you use for Windows.
Sure. So as you'll probably read in the blog post, Windows doesn't have mechanisms such as Linux C groups, LXC, SE Linux. There's no way, there isn't a namespacing capability in Windows. What we did for sandboxing on Windows is we use a bunch of different mechanisms to sandbox an application so that it cannot get out of the sandbox, as in it cannot read data where it's not allowed to read, it cannot crash the system, etc. So we use Windows users, non-privileged users for each sandbox. We use job objects, we use disk ACLs, disk quotas, and a bunch of different other mechanisms to to try and sandbox an application. And I encourage everyone to read the blog post because it describes this in much more detail. And also, the Windows Isolation Library is also open source, and we have documentation on how we've built parts of it and how we want to build the rest of it in the future. So please read this too. It's a very good way to get started and maybe even start contributing.
That would be great, because I think that's one of the things that we're really very lucky to be working with you guys and all of your Microsoft expertise. But now we expect the rest of the community to come and step up, especially around the documentation too. If you have time enough to read it and find any things that need to be highlighted or extended in the documentation, for whether it's the Uhura software explanations of OpenShift.net or OpenShift itself. Documentation is a great way to get started, and it looks like there's a little effort here that has to go on around documenting. So I'd be pleased to have anyone help on that. So what's next for this endeavor? I know there was a little talk about, and I'm not even sure I should say it out loud, but the porting M Collective over to C#. Is that, are there new things you're tweaking on and working on here that might
Yeah.
coming up in the next?
So yeah, we thought about porting M Collective to C#. We're holding off on that for now because the surface area of the Ruby M Collective node is so small that it doesn't really merit so much attention right now. So maybe in the future we'll get back to that, trying to make it more stable, remove Ruby altogether from the Windows world. But we've put that on hold right now. We're working on support for moving gears in Windows districts. So right now you can actually add Windows to districts, Windows nodes to districts. You have to be careful not to add Linux nodes and Windows nodes in the same districts, but you can do that. What you can't do is move gears around on Windows nodes, and we're working on this right now. And we're also working on support for Jenkins builds for Windows apps. So again, that's going to be an amazing tool that will again bridge the Linux and the Windows world. You'll be able to use the same Jenkins server installation that you have on OpenShift for both Linux and Windows apps.
Well, if you get that done in time for the Jenkins conference that's coming up in Boston, that would be an awesome thing to present there. I think they would flip out. They'd like to see that. That would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you have a couple of cartridges, and I'm always interested in getting more quick starts and cartridges there for whether it's for the Linux side of the house or the Microsoft side of that. So are there any cartridges that are on your wish list to see added?
Right now we're working on a DIY cartridge, and we might also have to do some Java on Windows for this Jenkins implementation. So yeah, maybe Jenkins on Windows. Java on Windows would be interesting. Maybe using MSMQ, Microsoft's messaging queue. There are many others that I could think about.
Yeah, there are hundreds of others. It's always interesting because when we demo, and I'm sure I will lift your demos application for my purpose, twist it around, but we're always looking for new things and fun things to demo, and it'll be interesting to start building a few sample apps once the DIY cartridge is available.
Yeah.
And we're all of us are going to have to brush up on our Visual Studio skills.
Yeah. Well, of course, you don't have to use Visual Studio, so you can always push your source code to Windows nodes using Git. I just thought it would be nice if I showed all of these tools that are available to Windows devs.
Yeah. Well, this has been really awesome. call if there's anything anyone else wants to add in terms of questions you have or anything else. Feel free to pop up and ask. If to the end of our half an hour, and that's about the length I like. So I really want to thank you and the Uhurosoft team, all of you all around the world. There's some of you in Seattle, some of you in Romania. Is that where you're sitting, Vlad, today?
No, I'm actually in Redmond.
And
Danielle is in
oh, you're in Redmond today.
Yeah.
It's been great working with you all, and we're really looking forward to hearing more and having more things in the next release of Origin to chat with you about, and we'll shout out to see if we can't get some documentation people helping you with your endeavor to get the documentation for Origin up and available sooner than later.
Thank you, and
definitely.